Okay, well, we'll get started. I'm going to not move around as much because I'm going to try to record this for the benefit of people who are homebound and stranded, so I don't have to repeat lectures for myself again 2 times. But if we need to do that, we'll do that. The first thing I wanted to do is just start to, at the start of every class, sort of begin to showcase some of the various projects that people have done in previous offerings of History 303 to get your mind flowing about the proposals that are going to be due. As I said, there's an extension until next week for them. David Hussey, who's our TA, I was chatting with him about an hour ago. He's going to try to come, but he was stranded. He drives to here, and I guess there's like the snowplow left a thing in front of his door, which I understand because I saw lots of cars stuck on the way to campus today. So anyways, one project he did, he likes history and video games. His final project for History 303 was The Gaming Historian. And so he wrote a series of short little essays on a WordPress site. Here, Through Sam Fisher's Eyes, What Splinter Cell Can Tell Us About the Early 2000s. A little short essay on Leonardo da Vinci being accurately represented in Assassin's Creed. He was taking Professor Croker's class. And this plugin seems to be not working on my computer, but it was an interactive timeline for the Legend of Zelda, and thinking about user-generated or video game-generated histories. Some other projects, I briefly showed this before, using the Omeka platform. Collected a bunch of primary documents about a British home child, the sort of children who came over in the 19th century from the urban poor of London, came to Canada and suffered, in some cases, pretty horrendous treatment. And so she did an exhibit, digitized a bunch of documents, really did a good job of combining the primary sources with some narratives around it. So it could be as simple yet complicated as that. Somebody who really liked punk music did a Punk Canada digital archive, trying to fill things out, taking primary sources, trying to make a public history website into that field, which was quite effective. And then someone did a 3D printing project last semester called Getting a Hold on History. I mentioned this when we were talking about modeling. Here's the website. Here's the final product, which we have a copy of in the history department. But actually showing and going through the blog process of how he created the curves, how did he do this, what plugins did he use, etc. And that is an example of an exceptional final project for this class. So showing there's what he digitized, and there's the metal blade that obviously he didn't.
It must have cost him a fortune.
Actually, it didn't. That's a good question. So the 3D Print Center comped it for us, and they comped 2 copies of it for us. But even then, the production cost of it would have been, if I'd paid out of pocket, because I wanted a copy, would have been $50 to $60. So it's expensive, but it's not crazy expensive. And that's because the 3D Print Center, as we'll learn, they operate, I think they generate a slight profit, so they can keep the building. They pay market rent from UW, but they don't try to actually make much money.
So isn't it like $9 per square inch?
Yeah, it's some sort of square inch of the actual material you use.
Yeah.
So there's some pricing.
It's better to go through the university.
Yeah, it's better to go through the university unless you've got some in with a maker lab or something somewhere. Okay, I feel weird standing in front of my computer because I like to wander, but I'm going to talk for a bit, and then we're going to start a bit hands-on with the textual analysis component of this class. So textual analysis, I think, matters because of a problem that historians are facing. Historians are facing 2 big problems. And firstly, the big problem that we're facing, which I've mentioned before in this class, is that we're keeping more information than ever before. More and more information, both digitized primary sources and sources about our existence today. I was thinking I should have done a Twitter archive of the outrage I woke up to when I checked my Twitter timeline at 6:55 this morning and UW announced they weren't closing.
It's on CBC now.
It's on CBC. But these are the clear digital sources that 30 years ago, students were outraged that University of Waterloo didn't close. Most of their voices are lost. Now, most of their voices, at least that are being digitized, are kept. And so if information was previously transitory, a few things kept here and there in an archive, accessed traditionally, recorded in a newspaper, we now generate and retain tons and tons of information. We saw that in the Internet Archive. That storage has been crashing in price. And as James Gleick argues in this slide from his book, The Information, A History, A Theory of Flood in 2011, one of my favorite books, easily the best book of 2011, and one of my favorite books of all time. In this quote, he explains how the transition that historians and society is facing is that we're moving from essentially the scarcity-based economy of the information that we produced and consumed vanished. That was the norm, the default. The sights, the sounds, the songs, the spoken word just melted away. Marks on stone, parchment, and paper were the special case. Now expectations have inverted. Everything may be recorded and preserved, at least potentially. So we've got more information, and we're actually keeping it. And it's compounded by a second problem, which we're going to talk about next week, and that is that traditional archives, the kind of things in the basement of the Dana Porter Library, the National Archives in Washington, D.C., our National Archives in Ottawa, are under attack and they're falling apart. That their budgets have been cut dramatically. Library and Archives Canada, their digitization staff is down by 50%. They've stopped collecting things. And so I think in the future, our problem is, and what we need to start developing skills for now, is that our sources are going to be digital because of this process. And the people who traditionally dealt with and accessioned our sources and made it all nice and tidy for us to work with, they don't have any money and they're actually not able to collect this stuff now. The problem, though, is that a lot of people hear me talk about this. I talk about this in class and elsewhere. And it sounds a little dystopian because we're talking about things like the 1990s as if it's history. And so a question I think that's worth wondering, when is this flood of information going to become the proper project of history? And I think it's going to be about now. My first book, as some of you know, was in the 1960s, Rebel Youth, a bestseller in Amazon. I'm lying, it's not a bestseller. I looked at the 1960s, and basically after 1968, 20 years later, historians are studying 1968. By the 1980s, the 60s seemed like history. We're now in 2015. The World Wide Web really becomes sort of everyday people begin to use it in 93, 94, 95, 96. Web archives go back to 1996. We're going to be using it, but we don't actually have archivists to help us out. And so I don't think historians are ready for this amount of data. And I think if we're going to be ready, and why I think this class is really important, is because we're going to have to turn to text analysis. The first website was published in 1991. It's now 2015. So some numbers can help bring the problem into relief. And I've used this example before because I love it. I think it's a beautiful building. It sticks in my head, and it's the Library of Congress. Largest library in the world. Everybody believes that except for the British Library. 838 miles of shelf, 26 million volumes, as I said, and it's monumentally large. But the Internet Archive, where we're going to look at some sources today, and which we come back to again and again, one of the newer libraries in the world, the newest repositories of historical information, is massive. This here is a petabox. It's essentially a self-contained bunch of racks that's designed to process and analyze 1 petabyte of information, or 1,000 terabytes, or 1,000,000 gigabytes. So think of how many gigs you've got on your portable devices. Imagine 1,000,000 of them fitting into one of these boxes. This is what James Gleick was talking about. This is this idea of more and more text and more graphical information being kept, our historical record becoming monumentally larger than ever before. So basic statistics. And again, that comparison between there's Library of Congress there. If I go in, I steal every book, and I digitize it at 300 DPI. There's the Internet Archive at 15 petabytes. So what can we do with all of that data? What can we actually do with the things that the Internet Archive is collecting, that Google is collecting, that ProQuest is collecting, that JSTOR is collecting, that all of these databases we use but don't always think about? What can we do with that information? Now, the first project is this. Sorry, I'm feeling very circumscribed by being tethered to a microphone. I'll never offer to do this again. The first project that came to mind is the Culturomics project, the Google Ngram project. Who here has used the Google Ngram viewer? We briefly looked at it on this first week of class. The Google Ngram project comes out of the Culturomics Institute, the Harvard Cultural Observatory, and basically they went in, they worked with Google, they got 5 million books. I want you to read the article, I'll put a direct link to learn. They took 5% of the books ever published in human history. They ran it through and they generated the OCR, or Google in many cases had already generated the OCR, that process of turning that D into a text file D instead of a shape D. And they argued that if you analyzed it for word and phrase frequency, you could begin to map the rise and fall of cultural concepts over time using big data. And so we can see some examples. Here's the reading that you'll be doing this week. I'll come back to this. And if we actually switch to it, which I'll do right here, we can begin to query things. So the example I like to use is nationalize and privatize. We'll take that back to 1900. For those poor souls stranded at home, I'm stepping away from the mic. You just have to follow along at home. And here, for example, I use a Scaffold History 250, but the idea of nationalizing, privatizing. Nationalizing is the idea that the government should take a larger role in the economy, should take, say, a steel mill and take it over. Or should take Petro-Canada and take it over, take an airline and bring it under the control of the federal government. And that idea begins to ascend. We see it peak. The Second World War shows, in many cases, for many Canadians, that nationalization works, brings our economy back up to full speed after the Great Depression. We see it rising into the 1960s with the idea of big government, the war on poverty, etc. And we see it as if on a cue begin to decline after the oil crisis in 1973, where it's replaced by another cultural idea, that of privatization, which maps up well with the ascendancy of Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in Britain, and to a lesser degree, Brian Mulroney here in Canada. Or you can look at things like, as you'll see, they've got lots of great examples in the reading. You can see flu. You can see, I like this one, Great War, World War I. Actually, I'll do First World War. We can see here, this is another example that shows how it works. Here's the Great War. That's what the First World War is called before the Second World War. The Great War, and we see it peter off to be replaced with the First World War, and the Second World War happens. So we see how word changes go over. Or we can see things like, I should go back to 1700. I'll have to get the exact, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but you can see the shift from the United States as a plural entity to the United States as a singular entity through the Google Ngram viewer as well. So you can do lots of cool stuff with the Google Ngram viewer, and I'm really looking forward to in your blog post that you'll be playing around with it. Now when we look at this reading, Jean-Baptiste Michel et al., Quantitative Analysis of Culture Using Millions of Digitized Books, which you're going to read because you do all the reading. In Science Magazine, high profile, probably the most high profile academic journal in the Western world. When you read it, you'll see that there's 13 authors. 13 individuals plus the Google Books team. There's people from English Lit, there's people from computer science, there's people from biology, there's people from mathematics, but there are no historians on that author list. There's no historians in the project that generated these figures. There's no historians who were involved in the underlying preconceptions. We use it, but we weren't involved in developing it. And this was a big deal for us as historians. Now, the president of the AHA, who I mentioned, we've encountered the AHA quite a few times, called out the Culturomics team for not including historians. And they said the historians who came to the meeting were intelligent, kind, and encouraging, but they didn't seem to have a good sense of how to wield quantitative data to answer questions, didn't have relevant computational skills, and didn't seem to have the time to dedicate to a big multi-author collaboration. It's not their fault. These things don't appear to be taught or encouraged in history departments right now. And this is why text analysis matters to historians, because this is the future of this form of research. And right now, historians can't even get a seat at the table because we don't know how to talk to other people. That this is a problem that's going to accelerate because the internet is now well over 20 years old. The web is now well over 20 years old. And before historians, if we're going to deal with this, we need to develop the infrastructure to do large-scale search and analysis. If the web argument doesn't convince you, I want to leave us with one final example. And that is how overnight our discipline has been transformed by digital objects and textual analysis. And that even if you're thinking, boy, I would never do this because I don't study the web, my closing argument to you today before we start playing with some simple tools is that we all do textual analysis every day. We just don't know that we're doing it. Everybody in my department is a digital historian, but they're not critical digital historians. Because those of you who've gone to History 250 with me or have worked in the microfilm area, Haley looks down there, she's the expert in the microfilm area, know that this is, like when I was doing my PhD, like less than 10 years ago, this was a primary source that I used a lot of. I spent a lot of time in front of microfilm, cranking a wheel, et cetera, very analog kind of research process. If you look at how PhD students research now, and I've done it by looking at over 1,000 dissertations, we see that they use this. This is largely replaced a sort of analog, traditional primary source. Physically, I'm getting discombobulated. This is what's replaced our microfilm research, and to a large extent has actually replaced the process of going to libraries and flipping through manuscript portfolios. that this happened essentially overnight, that we came from this to this as a profession. And when I played through those of over 1,000 dissertations, I found this, again, stepping away from the mic, sorry people at home, that we're moving from here. This is how we cited the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Telegram, the Montreal Gazette, and the Ottawa Citizen. This is from my article in CHR that we read 2 weeks ago or so. And we see these are the consistent citing patterns down here. We see this is when it goes online. I said about 3 years makes sense for a dissertation to actually take advantage of new primary sources. And we see this massive transformation shift in that we cite the Globe and the Star far more than we cite these newspapers. And so if you were doing an article on a Hamilton strike, and you were writing a dissertation in 2000, you would have used the Hamilton Spectator. If you were writing about a strike in Kitchener-Waterloo in 2000, you would have used the Waterloo Record. But nowadays, if you're a PhD student, you're writing about a Waterloo strike nowadays, you're going to cite the Globe and the Star. And that to me is another example of how history changes without the actual primary record changing. We've let databases change how we write about the past, the sources we use, and how we write it. And the problem with this is because historians don't understand how the texts are constructed. They're constructed from microfilm, using OCR with all the scratches and crap you have on a microfilm, using it through a computer program. The accuracy rate is low, narrow columns, it wasn't optimized for any of this. Historians are using tools they don't understand. And it's had tremendously deleterious effects on our profession, I believe. And so all of this means is that I think if history is going to continue to be the leading discipline in understanding the social and cultural past, if we're going to continue to be the leading discipline, we're not going to be eclipsed by computer scientists, etc., when it comes to study the 1990s and the 2000s, we need to move towards thinking about digital, we need to start thinking about text, and we need to start thinking about how to harness all of this information that we have. That when the sea of digital information comes in, hokey as it sounds, that I want historians to be ready to swim. So what I want to do is do some in-class work to play with some simple text analysis tools. And we're going to get a little more in-depth as we move into Wednesday, where we'll do a little more sophisticated stuff. So I think I have all the slides, so I'm just going to go through them, and then we'll go through them, and I'll turn off the screen recording, because I don't want to listen to my voice anymore on a recording. Is that step one, we're going to find a text to analyze. We can do that at the Internet Archive, which would be appropriate given my lecture. I'll show you how to do it. I want to start off by making a word cloud. We'll talk about what's wrong with word clouds, but they're a useful gateway drug into data visualization. And then we'll talk about Voyant tools, which is a digital humanities, primarily English, but also philosopher and some historians who've been involved, produce tool to do textual analysis on larger data sets. And it looks a bit like that. Okay. So I'm going to turn off the recording. If people at home have any questions, if you made it this far, I'm proud of you. See me in my office hours, and we'll stop.